Welcome everyone to Arundel House for the launch of our latest Adelphi book, Harsh Lessons, Iraq, Afghanistan and the Changing Character of War. These two wars, started in 2001 and 2003 respectively, are still ongoing, as the fighting for Mosul's airport today underlines, although for Western militaries there's at least a dotted line post-drawdown. These wars forced painful transformations in Western militaries because, as Clausewitz observed, the nature of warfare is enduring, but its character often changes, and this book traces the military evolution of the conflicts and their changing character. The successful regime change operations gave way to prolonged insurgencies. The book also identifies the lessons that Western militaries can learn from the wars, and this may prove to be as important as the outcome of the wars themselves. This was the point that was made in an endorsement to the book by Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, author of Dereliction in Duty, and I have been informed, the US National Security Advisor since this week. Without further ado, I'll hand over to my colleague the author, Ben Barry. He'll talk for around 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A, and we are on the record.
The recent Iraq and Afghan wars have been the dominant experience of this century for the land and air forces of the US and its allies. They've changed a great deal. The wars have been well described by many lead journalists, and there's no shortage of memoirs from platoon commander upwards. But there's been much less discussion of how the characters of the wars evolved and their implications for the future. I seek to fill these gaps, and I hope I will help you see the conflicts and their implications from some fresh perspectives. I'm going to cover the main topics of the book in order of its chapters. Inevitably, I'll be highly selective. In 2001, the unforeseen requirement to remove the Taliban government from Afghanistan initially challenged the US military, but they ultimately succeeded. Conversely, regime change in Iraq had been thoroughly planned and drew upon a full range of US military capability. Both wars showed that a well-trained, modernised, networked conventional force with air superiority could defeat a less modernised and poorly trained conventional force. Unsurprising. But post-conflict stabilisation saw the US and its allies struggle to align ends, ways and means that were necessary for the military operations, reconstruction and political activity to achieve the desired operational effects that would achieve progress towards coalition or NATO or national strategic objectives. The US and its allies came extremely close to defeat. The principal factor behind this was inadequate strategic leadership by national leaders and their governments, including defence ministries and forces chiefs. Key contributing factors included weaknesses in intelligence and understanding of both countries, inadequate reconstruction, political strategies, military strategy, operational concepts, and tactics and equipment. These combined with failures across government and Western armed forces to adapt quickly enough to the unforeseen circumstances created opportunities that were exploited by insurgents and militias. And the ferocity of the armed opposition in both countries was a strategic shock to the US and its allies. Against opponents who were determined to fight, national contingents who were unable to fight or whose governments weren't prepared to allow them to fight were of little utility and often added military and political friction and baggage to the multinational force. So the wars reaffirmed that combat is the core military capability, and also that armed forces should be benchmarked against determined and capable enemies. It took several years for the US and its allies to adjust the ends, ways and means being employed. Adaptations were eventually made that allowed them to create sufficient security for limited political progress. Force had wide utility for the US-led regime change campaign and for the eventual conduct of counter-insurgency, COIN, operations. It also had great utility for the militias and insurgents that sought to disrupt reconstruction and security and further their political aims. And covert support for proxy militias helped Iran achieve its strategic objective of increasing influence in Iraq. But the widespread perception of intractability of the conflicts and difficulty in achieving strategic success resulted in a loss of confidence in the West of the utility of force. And the political and military credibility of the US and its allies was damaged, and these consequences live with us today. There's much evidence of suboptimal leadership and decision-making in Washington, D.C., London, CENTCOM, Baghdad and Kabul, particularly in the first half of both wars. This shows the vital role of strategic leadership by government heads, key politicians, senior military officers and civilian officials. The requirement for coherent and consistent processes for the formulation of national strategy was demonstrated. The effectiveness of the strategy, including the utility of the force being applied, must be regularly reviewed, drawing on reports from the operational theatre, and should also be tested within the machinery of government and against the assessments of outside experts. Strategy must balance ends, ways and means to produce an interagency plan that can then be used by military commanders, diplomats, development agencies and intelligence services to formulate interagency operational level plans from which tactical plans can be developed. And a political strategy is essential to provide the foundation for all operational and tactical activities. And this must include the host nation, national, regional and local governments as independent actors. And it must assess the risk that host nation governments will act in ways that make them part of the problem rather than part of the solution, due, for example, to corruption, politicisation and the existence of parallel structures. And dealing with these issues is likely to require a carrot and stick approach. The wars showed the necessity for military command at all levels, from the national capital through theatre strategic right down through operational and tactical. The wars showed that higher commanders had to have highly developed communication and interpersonal skills and the ability to influence a wide variety of actors. They had to gain and sustain the confidence of heads of government and defence ministers, or be replaced, and some were. Command was an important military capability in its own right. Most military headquarters were static and able to exploit large quantities of secure bandwidth and processing power. The multinational nature of the operations inevitably created frictions, particularly those arising from limitations on employment of different national contingents, the so-called national caveats. Commanders had a key role in minimising these frictions. In Afghanistan, NATO acted as a provider of political legitimacy and as a generator of forces, and NATO procedures helped to make national contingents more interoperable. Wars are multidisciplinary activity. It's also a contact sport. A common theme across both wars at every level was the importance of integration. This applied not only to combined arms military tactics and the considerable improvements made during the wars in integrating air and land forces and special forces and conventional forces, but also to fully integrating all levers of national power, military, intelligence, diplomatic, development, and institutionalising further interagency cooperation is likely to be an enduring requirement for future conflicts, but it will involve sustained effort. Many of the war's military lessons are of wide applicability. For example, there was often a political dimension to military operations right down to the tactical level, a concept which has been called armed politics. So understanding the situation, particularly the myriad local political, military and sometimes economic actors, became as important as the narrower understanding of orders of battle and military hardware as had usually sufficed before 9/11. And previously non-traditional military capabilities, such as language and cultural awareness, became as important as more traditional military skills. And it's likely that these capabilities will be required in future military conflict amongst the people. The challenge, though, will be to keep these capabilities alive in peacetime. Tactical action could have strategic effects. I'm sure you've heard of the concept of the strategic corporal, that low-level commanders' actions can have strategic effect. The war showed that the concept worked both ways. The most strategic corporals in the war were those that abused prisoners at Abu Ghraib, who dealt a killer blow to US legitimacy. This and the equally disgraceful abuse and murder of prisoners by British troops highlights the importance of getting the basics right, applying the Geneva Conventions, and requiring all military personnel to have a thorough understanding of the rules and the values that underpin them. But prisoners and detainees have to be seen as opportunities and potential assets rather than liabilities. From the outset of the operation, whatever the operation is, it is essential to deploy capable prisoner and detainee handling organisations and the qualified interpreters and interrogators necessary to generate information and intelligence, and there are unlikely to be any shortcuts in resourcing this. Successful stabilisation operations involve the concentration of sufficient ground troops to provide security for the people through a systematic clear, hold and build approach, also measures to control population movement, and expanding and decentralising tactical intelligence. Clearance operations saw infantry, armour, artillery and combat engineers attack insurgent strongholds, using combined arms tactics, complemented by reconstruction, development and information operations. The more the operations involved local forces, giving an indigenous face to build empathy with the civil population, the better. Infantry was probably the most important military capability for this, but the firepower and protected mobility of armoured vehicles was invaluable wherever the terrain allowed. Tactical integration of fixed and rotary-winged manned and unmanned air power into land operations greatly increased. Fighting in both wars ranged in scale from low-level firefights, ambushes and roadside bombs to core operations featuring several divisions. Tactical ground combat was sometimes as intense as that experienced in the Second World War, Korea and Vietnam. Militias and insurgents sought to exploit international forces' weaknesses and sensitivity to casualties by using asymmetric approaches, particularly improvised explosive devices, IEDs. As the popularity of the wars declined, protection and protective equipment became a much higher priority. Extraordinary efforts were made to protect international troops, often reducing their utility. For example, in Afghanistan, all infantry were equipped with handheld detectors, and specially organised and sophisticated counter-IED task forces were fielded. And armoured vehicles increased in size, weight and cost. International forces' casualty levels were reduced by a revolution in battlefield medicine, which then had uncomfortable consequences for veterans' organisations. To reduce collateral damage and civilian deaths, the US and its allies sought to use force with precision and discrimination. This involved highly restrictive rules of engagement and increasing use of precision bombs, missiles and artillery, linked to increasingly capable intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance and command and control capabilities. There was exponential growth in aerial surveillance. There was greater integration of tactical intelligence with national strategic intelligence, and networking all these capabilities allowed all source intelligence analysis to lead the attack of enemy networks. And special forces had an increasingly important but not exclusive role in this. But the full potential of special forces was only realised when their operations were fully integrated with those of conventional forces. But international forces enjoyed largely uncontested control of the air and the electromagnetic spectrum. They made extensive use of contractors and large operating bases. These conditions wouldn't necessarily apply in future expeditionary operations or those against a capable state enemy. Insurgents and states that might confront Western forces in future are likely to conclude from these wars that there is great value in decentralised organisation, asymmetric approaches, and cheap and simple ways of producing casualties, such as IEDs, mines, and low-technology mass-produced light weapons. The enemy was often more adaptable than the intervening nations. The pace of adaptation by the US and many of its allies, including the UK, was often too slow. And this reduced the effectiveness of coalition operations and increased the costs, both in casualties and in operational success. Why was this? Firstly, overconfidence. In the decade before 9/11, the US, the UK and NATO military operations largely succeeded. The main reason for this was that the opposition was less capable and motivated. So this created overconfidence, and many key decision makers in the US and its allies had been misled by the proponents of the revolution in military affairs, a concept that I don't believe was ever adequately tested against insurgents. The US Army and key Western militaries, including the British Army, had deliberately neglected the study of insurgency and counter-insurgency. This suggests that military concepts and capabilities must be evaluated against the full spectrum of conflict and that armed forces must be educated and trained accordingly. Secondly, defence bureaucracies and armed forces, such as the Pentagon and the UK MOD, wanted to continue with business as usual. And I'd commend to you a chapter in Robert Gates's book, Duty, entitled My War with the Pentagon. And this is the gist of it. Now, it was only when Gates imposed a sense of urgency on the Pentagon, the US Army, and the US Air Force that they then began applying the necessary energy and sense of urgency that the wars demanded. This isn't a new phenomenon. All bureaucracies always have considerable inertia, but forcing them to recognise that business as usual won't meet the imperatives of war and they must adapt to the war they have rather than the war they want is a key role of strategic leaders. The successful adaptations that were eventually made by international forces show that whilst technology can assist with adaptation, the key enablers and barriers to adaptation are leadership, culture, and mental and organisational agility. For the military, bottom-up adaptation by units was most successful when it was complemented by top-down adaptation, direction, and support from the leadership. So I deduce that leading adaptation is a core function of politicians, civilian officials, military leaders, and commanders at all levels. But an enduring challenge is going to be the energising of military command chains and defence bureaucracies. The penultimate chapter in the book is some analysis of what this all means for the utility of force and how you can better understand the utility of force in the 21st century. The wars confirmed the inherent unpredictability of war, where inconveniently the enemy has a vote and may also fight to the death to cast it. They show that war is a clash of wills between actors seeking to shape events to suit their political aims, seeking to gain and exploit all the advantages they can. Attrition, manoeuvre, symmetric and asymmetric approaches all had their roles. There were action-reaction dynamics on all sides where many improvements in tactics and capability were checked by a counter-improvement by the other side. Both of the short regime change campaigns can be seen as linear conflicts. Subsequent post-conflict stabilisation campaigns were very complex, non-linear campaigns with many variable factors which interacted with each other in constantly changing ways. For example, in Iraq, there was considerable overlap between militias, organised criminals, and political and religious extremists, and legal political parties, and death squads. In both countries, crime and extortion often funded insurgent activity. Military operations were overlaid with complex and multiple political, religious, ethnic, and economic conflicts. The strategic, operational, and tactical levels often overlapped, and a high degree of complexity endured through both wars and was found at every level of command. General Petraeus, in 2007, was quoted as saying, "War's not a linear phenomenon, it's a calculus, not arithmetic." Or as his deputy, the British Lieutenant General Graham Lamb, put it at the same time, "This is as complex as anything I've ever done. This is three-dimensional chess in a dark room." Those of you who know General Lamb will know that there's a few expletives deleted from that quote. Commentators often saw the wars as conforming to the concept of three-block war. Now, this was described in 1999 by US Marine Corps General Charles Krulak as contingencies in which Marines may be confronted by the entire spectrum of tactical challenges in the span of a few hours and within the space of three contiguous city blocks. And he went on to explain that you could easily see an operation where they were fighting in one city block, securing a second city block and weeding out insurgents, and delivering humanitarian affairs in a third city block. Now, this certainly applied to the 2003 British attack into Basra province early in the war. At one point, the British had besieged Basra city and were attacking it with airstrikes, indirect fire, and raids by ground troops, while simultaneously conducting stabilisation operations in the town of Al-Zubayr, as well as distributing humanitarian supplies. But in Iraq, it became more complex. And one of the things I do in the book is analyse what HQ Multinational Forces Iraq was doing in mid-2008. It was attacking Sunni and al-Qaeda insurgents, both with conventional forces and special forces, in the belts around Baghdad. It was countering Shia special groups in Baghdad and Basra. It was growing, training and equipping the Iraqi security forces. It was administering the Sons of Iraq militias. It was mentoring the Iraqi Ministry of Defense and the Interior. It was also seeking to persuade Iraqi Prime Minister Maliki to employ his forces in ways that reinforced political progress rather than inhibited it. It was also attempting to reduce friction between Iraqi government forces and Kurdish Peshmerga units, and it actually had to deploy US troops in a peacekeeping role in northern Iraq between the two. And finally, seeking to avoid Kurdistan being destabilised by Turkish strikes against PKK guerrilla bases in Iraq. And this involves sharing intelligence and drone imagery with Ankara and effectively deploying a senior liaison team to the Turkish GHQ. So 3 blocks of wars had increased to at least 8. The war in Afghanistan looks just as complex. So I see these wars as less the 3-block war, but more the N-block war, where N is the sum total of the lines of action. And I'd suggest this is an enduring trend. The post-conflict stabilisation operations, and actually most of the regime change, were wars amongst the people. The main efforts were in the urban areas of both countries and the densely populated breadbaskets of southern Afghanistan, like Helmand and Kandahar provinces. They were contests for the minds of the populations, insurgents, militias, and their leaders. So the established principles of insurgency and counterinsurgency implied. And this included the primacy of politics, addressing the root causes of the insurgency, and making progress in governance and development. The wars show the importance of achieving legitimacy and operating in accordance with the law, and international forces often struggled to achieve this. And this was exacerbated not only by abuse of detainees, but inadequate understanding, poor intelligence, and counterproductive tactics. Often characterised by British officers as armed politics, these campaigns were contests for the mind and roll into that the political dimension down to the tactical level. And this interpenetration and interdependence of war and politics was amplified through 21st century communications. And these communications, particularly satellite television and increasingly the internet, accelerated passage of information of varying degrees of accuracy, truth, and rumour. Insurgents used these means to get their message across. Propaganda of the deed, it was an integral part of their operations. Coalition information operations were initially under-resourced, constrained, and much slower, so the advantage usually laid with the insurgents and militias. So the battle of the narrative became increasingly important, often as important as the armed conflict, sometimes more so. So this tells us that information operations need to be treated as central to military operations, and it will be as important to manoeuvre in the modern information environment as through land, sea or air. In some cases it will be more so. And this will be the core business of military commanders, who will require more effective capabilities than those used in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, messages must reflect reality on the ground, not assume the hallucinatory qualities that some early messaging from the US government did. Now, the book suggests some ideas that might help those grappling with the challenges of understanding and conducting current and future war. I ran a number of seminars and discussions for this, and I was often asked, well, cut the crap, Ben. How does this help us think about future war? Well, I've got two alternatives for you. One way might be to take the writings of Clausewitz and lay on top of them Hobbes, Machiavelli, and The Utility of Force by Sir Rupert Smith, and lay on top of that pile the DVD box sets of House of Cards and Game of Thrones. A much cheaper way is to use some of the ideas in my book, particularly on politics, the battle of the narrative, the en bloc war, and learning under fire. So I think the wars show that if successful regime change isn't followed by successful stabilisation, the conflicts can be as bad, if not worse, than those the regime change was originally intended to create or solve the problem. They illustrate the long-term nature of such endeavour and the need to use all instruments of national power. Now, the wars don't prove that counter-insurgency is impossible. They certainly demonstrate that many of the decisions made by the US and its allies made the wars even more difficult than they might have been. Now, of course, Western governments are increasingly seeking to avoid similarly costly and unpopular interventions by building the security capacities of fragile and failing states to deal with insurgency, terrorism, or hybrid threats. And we see this, for example, in Nigeria, in Somalia, and it's the centre of gravity of the Western-led coalition's approach to the defeat of ISIS. But the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan suggests that this shouldn't be solely a military effort. It must be multi-agency from the outset. But the credibility and effectiveness of the military component will depend on those armed forces demonstrating combat capability and also on their understanding of countering insurgents and terrorism. And despite the unpopularity of the Iraq and Afghan wars, the preponderance of intra-state conflict, and that I imagine will be reinforced when we release the Armed Conflict Survey later in the spring, suggests that any assumption made by Western governments or armed forces that counterinsurgency capabilities aren't required in the future, such a decision would carry considerable risk. And Western forces will require a critical mass of understanding, capability and skills to be able to regenerate such capabilities. Now, the observant amongst you might notice that I'm wearing an army regimental tie, which is actually the tie of the bugler reflected there against some of the commemorative panels on the memorial wall set up in Basra, which is now in the National Memorial Arboretum. The left-hand central panel commemorates Corporal Paul Thomas, who I'd actually had the privilege of commanding in a previous life. He was killed in Basra. He was a volunteer to go and serve outside his own regiment with another regiment which was under strength. And he led a counterattack to destroy the attackers who'd ambushed a convoy. So he marched to the sound of the guns and showed considerable courage and skill in doing so. And that's just one example of a lot of the fighting. And I know there are plenty of people here in the room, both military and civilian, who grappled with the difficult challenges of both wars. But one of the ways we can best commemorate all the people who were killed is by making sure that we avoid the avoidable mistakes. That's it.
Ben, thank you very much for that very cogent and detailed overview. You talked about being at war, but the point I would make and would seek your thoughts on is, did we in the United Kingdom actually ever really get our heads around the idea conceptually that we were at war? I'm reminded in my former organisation saying to somebody, we need to move to a wartime tempo of operation, and I was told, well, we're not at war. That was an easy thing to deal with in a small organisation, but within the Whitehall village, I'm not sure that we ever really did fully conceptualise what we were dealing with, much less sell it to our population. So, how does one address that? How does one develop a clear-cut conceptualisation of what was at stake here?
Nigel, that's a very good point. It's quite clear that the US, particularly the Pentagon, thought that it was more at war. But the examples of the real shaking of the tree of the Pentagon that was administered by Robert Gates from 2006 onwards showed that actually it hadn't penetrated all parts of the system. In the case of the UK, whilst then Prime Minister Tony Blair and the machinery of government did what it had to do in the run-up of war in terms of setting up the key military strategic decisions. For example, Blair twice visited the chiefs of staff and looked them in the eye, asking if this was going to work. There's abundant evidence from the Iraq inquiry that the management of the war was suboptimal. Blair chose not to use a National Security Council or a war cabinet, and the Iraq inquiry has exhaustive detail on how often things were dropped or decisions were made and then not properly implemented. And there's a particular time in 2003 when Blair returns from Iraq saying the government must go back on a war footing, which would appear to have made no difference at all. And in addition, he then went on to declare over a VTC to President Bush that he would do everything he could to support the coalition provisional authority in the south that Britain had volunteered to lead. And the inquiry lays out in exhaustive detail how this did not happen. I quote from this in the book and also from the memoirs of the late Sir Hilary Sinnott. And it's really a case proven. So part of the mindset, I think, of any government once it's involved in a war is to set up something like a National Security Council in executive session or use a war cabinet. It's also for the head of government and also the high leaders like the foreign minister, the defence minister and the service chiefs to satisfy themselves they understand what's going on. And they can visit theatre, but they can also empower special representatives or personal representatives to do this. The other factor I'd offer in the case of the UK is, I'm afraid the leadership of the British Armed Forces between 2003 and 2006 tried to make the war conform with the defence planning assumptions and their force structure rather than optimise the military contributions to southern Iraq.
Okay, Kevin, three in a row here.
Krystyna Maria Wilczek, I'm very much touched by your book because I was very much suffering when all these boys give their life in Iraq for no reason. So what is the problem when a politician has no political maturity, misuse the word for security reason, which they use a fantastic prepared instrument, which is a military, for no reason. No reason. So it is maybe better in the future to create an international organization of military leaders to prevent conflict, to prevent war and space research, instead to serve for sometimes mental sick deliria, which has no reason.
There have often been suggestions like yours. They've usually stumbled on the practical realities of the United Nations. I mean, in the Institute, we'd observe that in the case of Africa, we do see a growing continental and regional ability to put together multinational operations in the interests of peace and stability. AMISOM's a good example, as was the recent intervention to depose the leader who was staying on outside his welcome. There's one other thing you've touched on which relates to Nigel's question, which is that military commanders have got to speak truth to power. And furthermore, defence ministers or other government ministers have got to speak truth to power. It's certainly not clear to me that in the first half of the Iraq war and the Afghan war that applied to the senior British military leadership. And the Iraq inquiry, in an excellent section called Optimism Bias, has forensically dissected at least 4 occasions when Defence Secretary Des Brown gave hugely over-optimistic assessments of Iraq to the Cabinet.
Kevin, this gentleman there, please.
David Ramsbottom, a member of the Institute. Your final point was the importance of retaining a coin capability. And I remember asking General Robin Brims, who commanded our division that went into Basra, what was the battle-winning equipment as far as he was concerned. And he said the American Marine Air Wing, which was put under my command, which contained everything that we needed, none of which the Royal Air Force could provide. And I just wonder whether there's evidence that the coin capability is not just being looked at nationally, but being looked at in the result of international lessons as well.
General Robin Brims was one of the people I interviewed, and I'd commend to you a recently published book by Tim Ripley called Operation Telic, the first third of which is about what was really quite an imaginative British approach to evicting the Iraqi regime from southern Iraq and Basra. On air power, there was tremendous advances in air-land integration made, and part of the problem with 1st Armoured Division is the British had allowed air-land integration as a skill to slightly fade away, and that the US Marine Air Wing also came with a whole load of integration assets that joined 1st Armoured Division, was a great help. Ironically, at the same time, the RAF Tornadoes were playing a decisive role in smoothing the way for the US 3rd Infantry Division and the 101st Airborne on their great hook through the desert. I have no doubt, and I say this in the book, that air power was decisive. And I think the example that really proves this is Helmand in 2006, where the initial British plan for some clear hole and build is derailed by the governor wanting something else. So you end up with most of 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, and some reinforcements scattered in small platoon or company minus houses, where they come under sustained attack from hundreds of Taliban over a sustained period. I've no doubt if it wasn't for satellite communications and for the ability to apply offensive air power and get the supplies in and the casualties out by helicopter, all those houses would have fallen, and there'd have been lots of British troops killed and the remainder paraded by the Taliban. We would have seen 21st century Rorke's drifts. The downside of air power, of course, is its potential for civilian casualties and collateral damage. But I think in both wars, in the stabilisation operations, as the wars went on, there was increasing potential. By the way, I may be guilty of an oversimplification. I'm not saying that those coin capabilities are exclusively for counter-insurgency. We've done a lot of work on hybrid warfare here. And many of those capabilities are very relevant to many hybrid scenarios.
Okay. Right, gentlemen at the front, but please keep your hands up so I can see you. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. Please.
Christopher Elliott. Ben, marvellous speech. Thank you very much indeed. From that, I draw some of the things you said. That commanders have to have high interpersonal skills, high strategic instinct, political understanding, leading, adaptation, and being adaptable themselves, speaking truth to power. Any thoughts about how you can find and then train such people?
I should say that Chris's book, High Command, is a merciless examination of the failures of British High Command in Iraq and Afghanistan, and certainly well complements much of what I say. Well, one way you can find them is having a military system that identifies people with those characteristics and promotes them. So I'm not, these characteristics in the way that Chris describes them, and perhaps in the way they're brought together in the personality of General Petraeus or H.R. McMaster, or indeed General Mick who's commanding in Afghanistan right now. The military system has got to find a way of finding these people and encouraging them. In peacetime, one way you can do this is through training, is having rigorous training that puts people under the pressure of battle, and technology over the last 30 years in terms of weapon effects simulators and synthetic environments has created fantastic new training opportunities. It's been a quiet revolution that's been underreported. I think the other thing is there's a key role here for the heads of the armed forces, and a very good case study which exemplifies this is General Marshall, the chief of the US Army in the Second World War, who basically managed the selection of officers. It's a very difficult problem. The other thing that will help with this is not just military exercises, but government level exercises, where actually government ministers and the senior military and the senior officials are taken away from their day jobs and actually forced to consider the operational problems they have to tackle in a particular scenario. And what I think is ironic is if you look at UK government, and I stand to be corrected by some of you here, there's actually a very highly developed programme of exercises for counter-terrorist scenarios that has existed since the 1980s. The kind of government level exercises that occurred in the Cold War, when, for example, Mrs. Thatcher and the Minister of Defence used to actually practice their role in leading the UK's contribution to NATO in a World War III scenario, that doesn't appear to be happening. No, okay, Paul, those are very good points. Well, one of the answers to the numbers problem is to generate local forces as quickly as you can. It carries with it its own problems, but I think, in Western militaries that's now well understood. We do see counterinsurgency operations that are going in the right direction. After a difficult start, pushing back Boko Haram in Nigeria. Iraq slowly evicting ISIS, though, as you say, the political issue of the tension between the Iraqi government and the Kurdish authorities still hasn't been solved. On armed politics, I didn't say that this eliminates the need for the use of force. It's definitely armed politics, and the key trick for commanders is going to be where the sliders on the arms and the arm bit and the politics bit go. In the book, I have a case study of Gamsa district in southern Afghanistan, which shows politics, armed action, and development all working in synchrony. The other thing I'd say, though, is don't forget government forces do have advantages. Major asymmetric advantages, the air. And although the book is not looking forward in detail, I think future land forces, they can really leverage the air much more than they're doing by exploiting technology of unmanned systems. And governments usually control communications networks. And finally, they've got at their behest considerable amounts of processing power to drive their intelligence. So numbers, I'm sure, will always be a problem, but a key thing for security forces in the widest sense is using their asymmetric advantage to focus their efforts where they're really needed.
Thank you. Lady in second row by the window, please.
Larissa Brown from the Daily Mail. There's been calls today for the government to be more transparent when it comes to reporting the RAF campaign in Iraq and Syria. And I'm just wondering, do you think that the public should be told and Parliament should be informed when British pilots are killing British citizens in Iraq and Syria? Thank you.
Well, the Americans had this uncomfortable problem to grapple with during the course of both campaigns, and it's not one I consider. From the point of view of the military, they will, militaries will want to be as transparent as they can, partly because it's more and more difficult to hide given the proliferation of social media in the operating environment. Where they will feel tension is that there are some capabilities, like special forces and some of their intelligence gathering capabilities, that they really don't want to share with anyone because it's part of their asymmetric advantage. And actually, credit to the British press, there were a number of very high-tech asymmetric capabilities that were deployed by the Brits in Iraq and Afghanistan. which would have been blindingly obvious to a half-informed defence journalist, but defence journalists actually respected the operational security. And I think, it's a question of mutual confidence between military commanders, ministries of defence and armed forces. There's never going to be a perfect solution, but actually the effort that was made by the US and Brits and other contingents to embed about 1,000 journalists in the forces that attacked Iraq in 2003, in many respects, I think that was a positive thing.
Right, there's a lady right in the middle, about the 6th row. Most difficult place to get the microphone in the room.
I know, it was difficult enough getting in once everyone else had sat down. Thank you, and thank you for this this talk. It's been really, really very interesting. I was wondering, you've already mentioned that the book doesn't look too far forwards, but I was struck by some of the... I didn't even say who I was. I'm Emily Knowles from Remote Control. I was struck by some of the lessons that you identified there, and I was wondering whether I could hear more of your thoughts about the applicability to current UK military operations. I mean, one of the big effects of Iraq and Afghanistan was this move away from kind of, whether for political reasons or for budgetary reasons or otherwise, a move away from large boots-on-the-ground style operations towards a kind of lighter footprint approach, which is, as you correctly identified, what we're seeing more, working through local partners more and more, using UK forces to kind of bolster and assist. With a lighter footprint for UK forces on the ground, how much do you think that the lessons about COIN, the lessons about sort of strategic coherence, getting political objectives sort of aligned, hold and work? And is working more through partner forces going to complicate things when it comes to achieving that kind of strategic narrative that you've talked about today?
The answer to your several questions is yes, in that you make good points, and I'd say the answer is yes. If you look at the Army and the Royal Air Force, in their structures and the equipment you've kept, you can see a real effort to institutionalise many of the hard lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan. And examples of this are, for example, the British Army's Intelligence, Surveillance and Reconnaissance Brigade, 77 Brigade, which really is a very unusual approach to combining many of those formerly niche capabilities. Similarly, in the Royal Air Force, you see a very balanced Air Force, balanced between combat service support and air logistics in the widest sense, where again, they've made a real effort to keep the unmanned aerial vehicles and the Astor system. And my contacts with the sort of middle and senior ranks of the Army and the Royal Air Force is that many of them get it. The question I have is that whilst the Army and the Air Force have been through an uncomfortable and bloody forming experience, the extent in the British Armed Forces to which the Royal Navy has evolved in the same period of time. Iraq and Afghanistan, in terms of being complex conflicts, there was only a small maritime dimension as opposed to using aircraft carriers for the projection of power and securing the sea lanes. And navies as a whole don't seem to have been through that. But just, there's a sort of, the UK doesn't have a war college, which many other armed forces have. The nearest equivalent is the Higher Command and Staff Course. And I attended their annual reunion a few weeks ago. And the people I know who are there and the topics of conversation, I think, suggest that there's generations of people who really understand the points you've made.
Okay, Karen, as a man about that, you've been waiting quite a long time. Please.
Thank you. Suresh Guptara. Thank you very much, very insightful, and we now don't need to purchase the book because you've already given us all of the information, so that's excellent, thank you. My question relates to some of the capabilities, I think perhaps also connected to the previous question. You mentioned the need for understanding wherever you are deployed, the local terrain, as it were, human terrain, languages and the culture involved. The US, I don't know whether the UK did this, but the US had some form of human terrain experts integrated into some of their, sort of at the platoon level, I believe, which were then not exactly used appropriately because the commanders didn't know how to use them. how do you see the need for understanding to be at that level, at sort of down on the ground platoon level, and do you see that broader need for militaries to have this understanding, tying in perhaps with something like the NATO framework, the U2P2, understand to prevent, which sort of in some ways seems to be moving towards viewing soldiers as war and peace experts? Or is that, in your opinion, getting soldiers too complex a task for what they actually should be doing? I hope that question makes sense. Thanks.
Well, soldiering is, it's an outdoor contact full-season sport. And extraordinary demands are made of low-level soldiers and their leaders, for example, young platoon commanders. So their combat leadership, the combat leadership role has to be foremost. But as people climb up the food chain, they need to acquire a wider range of skills in the military. And I'm sure the same applies, for example, in diplomacy and intelligence services. I mean, this is one of the longest sections, actually, in the book about understanding. The understanding for Iraq regime change of the metal boxes, the armoured vehicles, the aircraft, the radars of the Iraqi forces was pretty good. The understanding for regime change of Afghanistan was very poor because the US had walked away from collecting intelligence on it. And it's actually the story of how the US rapidly evolved their concept for Afghanistan and used the CIA particularly to help energize the operation is quite a remarkable one. We shouldn't also forget that Saddam Hussein was the ruthless dictator who saw both Hitler and Stalin as role models. So human intelligence penetration of Iraq was always going to be very difficult, and the numerous inquiries into the quality of intelligence on weapons of mass destruction bear that out. But I think, understanding needs to be full spectrum. So it needs to be the classical order of battle and military equipment type of understanding, but it also needs to understand people, politics, and culture. And furthermore, the intelligence organisation and capabilities like human terrain teams, or, for example, the British deployed stabilisation advice teams right down to battalion level in Afghanistan, they've got to be integrated. I think one of the lessons is that commanders, when presented with new capabilities on the battlefield, or indeed when military systems are presented with new capabilities, they've got to be open enough to try and make them work.
Thank you. Lady just there, please. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sarah Ingham, researcher to General Lord Dannatt. John Nagel, the counter-insurgency expert, once described the British Army as a learning institution. Do you think books like yours, will the lessons be taken on board, these harsh lessons? But more importantly, are the same harsh lessons about strategic patience and political will to successfully prosecute conflict being learned by civilian leaders? Thank you.
I've seen some senior civilian officials amongst the audience, but I don't see any politicians who are presumably too busy to be here. I'd commend to the audience, actually, General Dannatt's book, Boots on the Ground, where he credits Sarah with a great deal of help with research and drafting the book. It has the most fantastic case study of the British Army's role in the post-conflict stabilisation of Germany, which brings together, albeit in a less lethal environment, many of the challenges coordinating civilian and political lines with the activity of the British Army in a way that, for me, was quite stunningly shocking. In the case of the British military, they had a system which they had developed from Malaya and then Northern Ireland, of trying to prepare units to go out there as best they could, making them as up to date as they can. But I think it was in 2008 when General David Richards took over as the Army Commander-in-Chief that he basically put the army on what he wanted to call a war footing, but was allowed to call a campaign footing. And one of the initiatives was to set up the Afghanistan counter-insurgency centre, which sat alongside a lessons centre, which when I went to do my work on the lessons of Iraq for British Army, both were working at full tilt. And indeed, one of the people credited in the acknowledgements of the book is Colonel Alexander Alderson, who's sitting front left, who set up the Afghan Coin Centre. Do the politicians want to learn the hard lessons? Well, you do detect quite a lot of it in public statements made by David Cameron when he activated and rebooted the National Security Council and chaired a meeting on his first day as coalition prime minister. And you do detect some of it in statements by defence secretaries since then. In the particular case of the Ministry of Defence, they're doing a thorough exercise to see what the lessons from the Chilcot report are from them. They've announced that they're doing it in public. And I'm sure they will do a thorough job. Whether the difficult lessons for government ministers, for example, what I see as a requirement for them to actually exercise their role in high-level decision-making in difficult conflict situations, whether those will be part of it, I don't know.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to disappoint a few people, and we're not going to get through everyone before the end, but Eric Grove, please, here in the third row. And Antonio, you still want to? Okay.
I very much look forward to reading the book. It's fascinating and very, very interesting. But the thought comes to mind that we're going to be very good at understanding everything that went wrong in the last war and analysing the last war. And that might not necessarily be the best way of approaching the next war. Because it seems to me that the next war, and this also reflects my sort of maritime interest, is probably going to be a more traditional kind of war, a more high-tech kind of war, or at least an ability to do that, to deter that kind of conflict breaking out. The Royal Navy is having to relearn a lot of things it did very well during the Cold War. Marvellous at boarding now, and that kind of thing, but not so good at anti-submarine warfare, and not so good at the high-level kinds of operations, which might well be necessary, depending on what happens in our relationships with Russia, almost at the Soviet Union then. So isn't it necessary, I think, while still putting a lot of effort, and it's very, very good, in finding out what went wrong. Perhaps the big lesson is don't get involved in this kind of conflict, as you said yourself. Don't try regime change. It's dangerous. So perhaps we ought to, but while understanding the past, realise that the next war may well be very different indeed.
Okay, let's take
Sure.
them as a pair. And
Okay.
Antonio, I presume, Antonio, you're going to be on urban warfare.
Yes, you're right, Nick, because the Security and Development Program is one of our main research streams, is urban conflict. And given what's happening in Mosul, I have to ask you what your evaluation is of the performance of Western and Iraqi forces in urban areas during the past 10 years. Because, as you know, Fallujah, we fought two battles in Fallujah. I mean, presumably, it denotes some kind of failure in stabilizing the area. Baghdad has also been a hotspot for insurgency during many years. So, did we do anything wrong? I mean, what are the lessons from on that front?
Maybe I've concentrated too much on the harsh lessons. In the book, I identify an awful lot of what went right, particularly in the second halves of both wars. It seems to me that actually armed forces have to be capable of working at both ends of the spectrum. Hard-edged state-on-state against peer competitors with lots of metal, right down to more diffuse countering insurgency, countering terrorism. And part of the problem with the British Army and the US Army is, for various reasons, they'd walked away conceptually from insurgency. US case after Vietnam, British case, they sort of did institutional forgetting of hard lessons of the early years in Northern Ireland. I'd say that there are plenty of British lessons of armed forces walking away from difficult lessons. It was 13 years between the end of the First World War and the British Army commissioning a lessons learned exercise of the First World War, which the then reactionary Chief of the General Staff hugely censored the product that was distributed out from GHQ, as it were. The Royal Navy gave up its global leading carrier capability and was overtaken by the US and the Japanese. Of course, as you will see in the military balance, where we show the capability, particularly orders and battles and equipment of all countries, but we also include a capability summary, an essay of anything from 250 to 1,000 words, which relate its defence policy to its capability, to what we think is its ability to execute its defence policy. Countries have very different policy requirements. But if you're a nation like the UK, France and the US, and you want to play a global role, the narrower the spectrum of your armed forces, the more risk that when you've got to do something, particularly something that the enemy has inconveniently made what you hadn't quite expected, you'll have a painful learning period. Antonio, there's a lot of stuff in the book that's relevant to urban conflict. We shouldn't think urban conflict is always going to end up like Stalingrad. The thunder runs the US did into Baghdad and the British incursions into Basra show that where the defender doesn't have much anti-armour capability, an armoured force with modern protected tanks and armoured vehicles can actually manoeuvre in an urban area. To many eyes, the Iraqi progress, for example, in Mosul is very slow. This is partly because the Iraqi forces have only got a couple of division equivalents that are actually trained sufficiently to conduct difficult urban clearance operations. One is the police division that we've seen recently. The other one is the Golden Division, the special forces. And in both cases, they've taken what were special forces outfits and turned them into elite infantry. You asked a question about Iran, didn't you?
No.
Okay.
Fallujah and Baghdad, the recurrent attacks and failures in stabilizing those cities, what they tell us?
Well, they tell us an awful lot about the weaknesses of the Iraqi security forces, which in 2008 were on a roll and were really quite good at counter-insurgency. But then, as well documented in a previous Adelphi book, Toby Dodge's book on Iraq, basically Prime Minister Maliki squandered the fruits of victory by replacing competent officers with political cronies, allowing hollowing out and allowing corruption to steal all their logistics. And it's quite remarkable so much progress has been made in 2 years that they've actually got two quite effective divisions. Is that my last question?
Yes.
I'll just make one observation, although it's not in the book. My grandfather served in Iraq as a bandmaster, and he spent a year going through Iraq, entertaining the British occupation troops and doing concerts with civilian communities. He left a fragmentary diary. He did Christmas Day on a football pitch in Baghdad. He did Boxing Day in Fallujah, and his diary entry says, lunchtime concert in Fallujah, splendid lunch laid on by very happy town council.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. Sorry to those who didn't get to ask the question, but maybe if you hang around at the end, Ben is usually very generous with his time, and I hope you have the chance to speak to him then. But please join me in thanking him.